11-01. In other words, 9/11. That's what it says right at the top. Both of the letters that were recovered have that date written at the top. So they're announcing, basically, to the world we are connected to 9/11, because there's no reason to believe they were actually written on 9/11, and they certainly weren't mailed on 9/11. But that's what they say at the beginning, 9/11. Then here's what this one says. This is next. This is all printed, by the way, and it's slightly primitive printing. This is next. Take penicillin now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great. And penicillin, okay, spelt wrong. So the kind of the idea is here that these are dangerous people. They're cunning savages, so to speak. They're dangerous, but they're not sophisticated. And, you know, if they've got a letter full of anthrax, and the anthrax is highly developed, they must come from somewhere else. So these are the field operatives, the al-Qaeda people. That's what I read from this message. And somebody sophisticated stands behind it. The other letter to the senator is very similar. It's basically something like, we have this anthrax. Are you afraid? Death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great, right? So that's what we're talking about. Those are the little letters that we can then analyze.
Right, and then that is supposed to make us think what? That Iraq and al-Qaeda had something to do with it?
Yeah, I mean, the average person wouldn't get all of that out of just reading the letter. But if you look at how these letters are being interpreted in the press at the time, that's the idea, yes. That these little guys that couldn't spell properly and were, you know, deaf to America, that they were presumably extremist Muslims who were the agents on the ground, like the 19 Arabs. And that this clumsy little letter, hand-printed with spelling mistakes, was incongruous in the context of highly, highly sophisticated anthrax. I mean, I can't overstress this. The anthrax in the two letters to the senators was, according to some observers, among the most sophisticated anthrax ever seen in terms of a weaponized product. There's no way al-Qaeda was cooking it up in little labs, and this was said very explicitly in the newspapers at the time. Therefore, somebody else had to have supplied the anthrax. So that's why I say when you combine the crude little letter with the sophisticated biological product in the envelope, you get this notion of the dual perpetrator.
And what do you think of the timing of the anthrax attacks?
Well, as I said before, it's a 1-2 punch. Don't let the U.S. population recover. This is a basic strategy in the original shock and awe doctrine. You are not to let your adversary recover. You keep relentlessly hitting them. And so you give them 9/11, and then you give them the anthrax attacks. And then if you can do a few more bombings in Europe and in London a little bit later, whenever people start to feel comfortable, you hit them with another terrorist attack. That's the only thing that's kept this stupid war on terror going, is, you know, every now and then there'll be another one of these attacks. Most of them, to the extent that I can tell by looking at them, or most of them are cooked up to keep things going. So, yeah, so that's the anthrax attacks. It's strike number 2 on the U.S. It enables the Patriot Act to go through. Senators Leahy and Daschle might have held up the Patriot Act's passage, but since their own offices, or at least in the one case, the office is thoroughly contaminated and a young woman gets ill, they're at this point being terrorized as well. And messages are being given out, sometimes not too subtly, it seems to me. If you get in our way, this is going to happen.
I'm speaking with researcher Dr. Graeme MacQueen. Today's show, Connecting the Anthrax Attacks to September 11th. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter.
So basically, I've talked about the structural and the historical approaches. I'd also say there's a symbolic level going on here, and I don't want to get too abstract and kind of boringly academic and postmodern and all that about it. Philip Saracen wrote a good book about this in, I think, 2006. But the gist is that anthrax is a particularly potent symbol. It's a silent, invisible, deadly agent which invades the body and corrupts it. And the body cannot defend itself against it, and death comes in an agony. And this becomes a symbol of the nation. says Saracen, and I think he's right. I don't think this is too fanciful. The nation as body, so that the nation, just as you can no longer have what you might call the free love body, the body that interacts in an open, loving, sexual way, let's say, with other bodies, the free love body. That's no good, because now you've got things that are entering the body. Historically, that would the parallel would be HIV/AIDS probably, which led people to say, okay, now we've got to go back to an older model of the body, the defended body, maybe even the fortress body, which doesn't interact freely with other bodies. What Saracen is saying is what's going on here is the nation is thought of as the body, so that America was at one time treasured its freedom above all things, and it could interact freely with others through free trade and free this and that and tourism, and suddenly all that is in danger, because these organisms, just as anthrax attacks the body, these Muslim extremists attack the pure nation. They invade the homeland, they desecrate the homeland, they create a kind of contamination, and therefore we must put up borders, no more free love nation. We have to reinforce the borders. We have to guard them. We have to have a fortress America, and we have to even be willing to go out and be extremely violent to other people to kill these pathogens before they can do us harm. So he has a lot of support that this is what's going on in the deep consciousness of people, and it's important really to think at this level. It's not just a matter of being clever, because a lot of what we're talking about here is not easily reduced to rational terms. I've taught courses on this kind of thing at the university, and I remember getting up showing the students, okay, in the year, let's say 2003, I don't remember, I don't have the figures here, but let's see how many Americans died through international terrorism. And there are, official statistics on this, and let's say it was maybe 12 that year, I don't remember. Well, how many Americans died through traffic accidents? Oh, 40,000. Okay, and how many died from smoking? That's maybe 10 times as many again, maybe 400,000. So why is it that we're not all going around, terrified of cars and cigarettes? The U.S. has this massive military budget skyrocketing because of terrorism, and the number of casualties is really very low. Well, see, it's not rational. We're not operating on a rational level. We're operating on a symbolic level, and the nation has been contaminated. And actually, there's a verse in your national anthem, which I guess isn't sung anymore, but it's worth getting out to look at, because it has a line in it that's something like, their blood will wipe out their foul footsteps pollution. This was talking about the British, I guess, in the War of 1812, but it applies very well to Al-Qaeda. In other words, they have come to our nation, and this is their foul footsteps pollution. They have polluted the pure body of our nation. And how do you get rid of that? How do you get rid of that? And at this extremely primitive level, the answer there is clear. Only their blood will wipe out this contamination. And that's why we knew that Americans would unfortunately be susceptible to warmongering, and that many people would pay with their lives for this attack, regardless of who did it. And they have paid for their lives in Afghanistan and Iraq, to take the two obvious examples. So when we're looking at this, we look at the structural level. What are the basic elements in an attack like the anthrax attack, and how do they line up? We look at the historical level. What are the actual events that connect 9/11, for example, and the anthrax attacks? And we look at that symbolic level, because it's very important.
Well, yes, that's a very interesting way of looking at it, as a contamination of the whole country. That's quite interesting. Could you briefly describe the Bruce Ivins affair and what purpose is served by the lone nut theory of perpetrators?
Yeah, good question. Well, there's two different questions there, and rather than starting off with a discussion of Ivins himself, although I can say a little bit about that, I'd rather talk in terms of the broad categories that you mentioned, like lone nut, because I actually think we make a mistake sometimes when we move too quickly to talk about Bruce Ivins. What that often does, even in people in the peace movement, is change the discourse so that the discourse becomes, what is the identity of the anthrax killer, right? The identity of the anthrax killer. And if we're looking for the anthrax killer in the singular, we've already missed the boat, because there was no singular killer. This was a group. This is a group. And one of the major things that the FBI and their associates has been able to accomplish is to get people to miss this rather obvious point. So let's go through this, because it should answer your question about the lone nut. If you do a little grid, with 4 quadrants, you see that there are 4 main possibilities for who could have carried out the anthrax attacks. It could have been a foreign individual, a person acting on their own from a foreign country outside the U.S. It could have been a foreign group, or it could have been a domestic individual or a domestic group. Those are the main 4 categories of possibility. And the brilliance of the FBI's approach has been that, first of all, everyone thought it was in the quadrant of foreign group, right? Or you might even say groups, Al-Qaeda and Iraq. Lots of people were involved. So the idea was all kinds of people were conspiring to do this. The bad guys conspired. That means they planned in secret to carry out an illegal act. That's what a conspiracy is. And you'll notice that when the bad guys, the enemy, conspire to do us harm, we consider that very natural, of course, because they're bad. They're the enemy. Of course they're going to conspire. You don't even need to use the word, because it's assumed. And I've never seen anyone accused of a conspiracy theory or of being a conspiracy theorist when they said that the enemy conspired, because it's just assumed that they're evil, so that's what they'll do. But things change when it becomes discovered that this is domestic. This comes from inside the United States. So suddenly the discourse changes from foreign group to domestic individual, right? The obvious other possibility is domestic group, but that ends up not being researched very much. It gets passed over. So if you read the final FBI's report on the anthrax killings, there's very little attention given to the possibility of a domestic group. They've basically slipped from foreign group to domestic individual. Well, what's that about? Well, the idea seems to be that we, and especially our beneficent governments, would never, of course, get together as a group and actually plan rationally in secret to deceive us and to murder us. No, that's unthinkable. So if evil has come from within our group, it must be a random individual who tells us nothing, really, about society as a whole, meaning it tells us